Yale University psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a study to measure obedience to authority figures. Individuals were brought into the lab and told that they were studying memory. 3 people were involved in the experiment: the learner, the teacher, and the experimenter. The learner posed as another volunteer, but was actually an actor. The learner was hooked up to an electroshock machine. The teacher, who was the only real volunteer and the subject of the experiment, was instructed by the experimenter to ask the learner a series of questions. When the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher was instructed by the experimenter to administer an electric shock. Prior to the experiment, the volunteer was given a shock to demonstrate the shock strength at the lowest level. The staged shocks increased in strength as the questioning and incorrect answers progressed. The actor, in a separate booth, could be heard wailing and crying out in pain each time the teacher administered a shock. After a certain number of voltage increases, the actor banged on the wall and complained about a heart condition. After several times banging on the wall and complaining about his heart, all responses by the learner stopped. If the teacher indicated a desire to stop the experiment, he was given a succession of verbal commands by the experimenter in the following order: "Please continue." Then, "The experiment requires that you continue." Then, "It is absolutely essential that you continue." Then, "You have no other choice. You must go on." If the subject still wanted to stop after all 4 commands, the experiment was halted. The experimenter also gave special commands if the teacher made specific comments. For example, if the teacher asked if the learner might suffer permanent physical damage, the experimenter replied, "Although the shocks may be painful, there is no permanent tissue damage, so please go on." If the teacher said that the learner wants to stop, the experimenter replied, "Whether the learner likes it or not, you must go on until he has learned all the word pairs correctly, so please go on." If the teacher asked who is responsible for any negative effects, the experimenter replied, "I will take responsibility, please continue." Before conducting the experiment, Milgram polled 14 Yale University senior year psychology majors to predict the behavior of 100 hypothetical teachers. All of the poll respondents believed that only a very small fraction of teachers, the range was from 0 to 3 out of 100 with an average of 1.2, would be prepared to inflict the maximum voltage. Milgram also informally polled his colleagues and found that they too believed very few subjects would progress beyond a very strong shock. Milgram also polled 40 psychiatrists from a medical school, and they believed that by the 10th shock, when the victim demands to be free, most subjects would stop the experiment. They predicted that by the 300-volt shock, when the victim refuses to answer, only 3.73% of the subjects would still continue, and they believed that only a little over 0.1% of the subjects would administer the highest shock on the board. Throughout the experiment, the quote-unquote teachers showed signs of stress and tension, but 2/3, 26 out of 40, administered the final 450-volt shock. Milgram tested 636 subjects in 18 different variation studies. He found only 20% obedience when the experimenter was called away and a non-uniformed participant took his place. The original experimenter wore a gray lab coat. He also found that 92.5% shocked to the maximum voltage when they were given an assistant to instruct versus administering the shocks themselves. Milgram's experiment has been recreated all over the world. Thomas Blass of the University of Maryland performed a meta-analysis of the experiment. He found that the percentage of subjects who inflicted fatal voltages averaged 61% in U.S. studies and 66% in non-U.S. studies. In The Perils of Obedience, Milgram wrote, "The legal and philosophic aspects of obedience are of enormous importance, but they say very little about how most people behave in concrete situations. I set up a simple experiment at Yale University to test how much pain an ordinary citizen would inflict on another person simply because he was ordered to by an experimental scientist. Stark authority was pitted against the subject's strongest moral imperatives against hurting others, and with the subject's ears ringing with the screams of the victims, authority won more often than not. The extreme willingness of adults to go to almost any lengths on the command of an authority constitutes the chief finding of the study, and the fact most urgently demanding explanation. Ordinary people, simply doing their jobs and without any particular hostility on their part, can become agents in a terrible, destructive process. Moreover, even when the destructive effects of their work become patently clear, and they are asked to carry out actions incompatible with fundamental standards of morality, relatively few people have the resources needed to resist authority. Today, Americans have a great disdain for Nazis, often evoking their name anytime they view something that is tyrannical from their perspective. It's ironic because in many ways the US population is just as susceptible to authoritarianism as the Germans were. Almost 2/3 of Americans will administer a fatal shock simply because someone in authority tells them to do so. These subjects were not forced to deliver the shocks, they were not threatened. Imagine that you're a German person during the rise of Hitler and the Nazi Party. What are the chances that you would defy the Nazis and risk your life to help Anne Frank? People who hid Jews were in the tiny minority. They risked their lives and the lives of their families. Statistically speaking, almost all of us would have obeyed the Nazis, and a large minority of us would have been in the Nazi Party. Very few of us would have been this guy.